They didn't have any formal protection at all. These were just simply roadless areas that had been inventoried in the original Rare 2 process, Roadless Area Review and Evaluation, back in 77 to 79. Forest Service had let me back up just because you raised an interesting question there, Ralph, and that is the original Rare. We have Rare. Everyone's heard of Rare 2, but in order for there to be a Rare 2, there had to have been a Rare to make the second one number 2. Okay, the original Rare, which occurred in the early 70s, was a effort by the Forest Service to recover from the Parker decision, which is in Colorado on the Eagle Range Gore's Nest primitive area. Forest Service was basically attempting to log right up to the boundary of the primitive area, and the basis of that suit was that wait a minute, you can't log next to the boundary because Congress is supposed to decide what the boundary should be, and if by logging to the boundary, you're deciding. You're in other words, you're in Forest Service, you're interfering with congressional prerogative here. So Forest Service lost the lawsuit. So the Forest Service said, okay, we're getting all kinds of litigation and appeals, so we're going to do an inventory nationwide of roadless areas, just like Bob Marshall did back in the 30s. And so he, and we will call them new study areas, and then we will, from this inventory, decide what we're going to study for wilderness, and we'll put an end, once and for all of this dispute and all of this controversy about our the roadless lands on national forests. Pretty naive, actually, when you think about it. Okay, so they did the inventory. Forest Service did the inventory, and in the process of doing that inventory, came up with about 55 million acres of roadless lands nationwide. Only 12 million acres of which they called new study areas. In other words, it would be reviewed for their wilderness suitability in their forest planning process. The rest of them would just be thrown into the mix for quote-unquote multiple use, roading, logging, whatever. Well, that's what that inadequate, that rather disappointing outcome from Rare is what prompted the Montana Wilderness Study Act, what prompted citizens led by Cliff Merritt to go to Senator Metcalf and to urge that these other lands drop from consideration for continued wilderness review by the Forest Service. That those lands would in fact be elevated to wilderness study status by Congress, thereby mandating to the Forest Service that they study the wilderness suitability. So that's what prompted it. The original Rare prompted the Montana Wilderness Study Act. And then and so the Montana Wilderness Study Act actually passed shortly before Lee passed away. He was very, very proud of that. In fact, he was in the hospital, and this was literally only 2.5 months before he died. But on November 1st, 1977, Jimmy Carter signed S-393, the Montana Wilderness Study Act, into law. After many years of battling on that bill and dealing with Melcher, not being able to get around Melcher on the House, well then Melcher had gone to the Senate, had taken Mike Mansfield's seat, and he was junior senator and not a member of the committee that had jurisdiction over public lands, the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Not even a member of that committee. He still caused a great deal of delay and difficulty with respect to passage of the bill, but we did get it done. And certainly then Congressman Baucus was very helpful too. I should give him credit because he wanted that bill passed. The bill, incredibly enough, keep in mind I was there because I was stationed in D.C. during 1977. A pivotal year for legislation in Montana, and so I and many other people, but because I was there, I witnessed a lot of what happened with the Montana Wilderness Study Act, and it actually went down in defeat because it was because we decided to try to get then Republican Congressman Ron Marloney for Eastern Montana. We had 2 congressmen then, and so we had Max Baucus in the House for Western Montana, and we had Ron Marloney for Eastern Montana. Okay, well, 2 of the 9 areas, we were down to 9 areas because I mentioned the Elkhorns previously in Melcher's bill. Okay, that with a 4-year sunset. Okay, so we had 9 areas in the Montana Wilderness Study Act, 2 of which, the Big Snowies and the Middle Fork Judith, were in the Eastern Montana Congressional District. 7 in Max's district. Max wanted the bill passed very badly. Okay, Marloney opposed the bill and did everything he could to kill it, and in fact he did. And the reason he did is that we decided, because of the amendments that were being planned that would have weakened the bill, would have taken out the open-ended protection, for example, that I mentioned. We decided to use a parliamentary procedure called suspension of the rules. And in fact, we met with Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, and got his approval. So suspension of the rules meant that no amendments could be offered, but it would require a 2/3 vote in the House to pass. It would be either up or down on a 2/3 vote. Well, it went down by about 30 votes. Reason being that Marloney got the Republicans and some Dixiecrats from the South to oppose it, and the bill was defeated. The first time in the history of the Wilderness Act where a bill actually went down in either house of the Congress. Well, we were stunned. But what we did is we initiated the most intensive campaign you can imagine, led by Max Baucus, where Max personally talked to every single one of 35 Democrats that opposed it. And a few Republicans actually supported it too, supported us on it. Because we were waging at that time a grassroots campaign within key congressional districts. This took place over a couple-month period, but not very long. It was a very intense, short campaign. And at first, the Speaker didn't want to bring it up again. He said, what's done is done. But Max convinced Tip O'Neill to bring it up again. And we put it on the calendar again, and we passed by about 5 votes.
Well, thank you, Max.
Yeah.
There are differences between formal designated wilderness and wilderness study areas, aren't there, in reality? I know John Gatchell, our conservation director, who's an incredible wealth of knowledge on the details. What does happen over time in areas that are wilderness study areas, but because of outlaw activity and maybe lax Forest Service function, we do lose some of these areas to motorized activity.
That's the biggest problem, is the escalation of motorized use in the backcountry. And a strict reading, and I think a correct reading of the Montana Wilderness Study Act, would say that whatever the use was as of November 1, 1977, within places like the Gallatin Range and places like Big Snowies and Middle Fork Judith and so on, Blue Joint, Sapphires, all these are some of the areas that we're talking about. The 9, there's actually 7 remaining, because because 2 of the original 9 have been dealt with. We can get to that here shortly. Okay, of these remaining 7, the biggest threat is motorized use, because we didn't have a baseline inventory of the amount of motorbike use, ATV, well, they didn't exist then. Snowmobile use was very minimal, except for the so-called Big Sky Trail through portions of the Gallatin and Madison ranges. But very little. Some dirt bike use, certainly, that was going on some of the trails. But had we been able to establish the exact use as of that date, and then held the Forest Service accountable to not allow any increase in that motorized use, then we would be in a much stronger position for wilderness for those WSAs. I know when I visited with Lee after the passage of the Montana Wilderness Study Act in November of '77, he very much regretted not being able to just go for what we called at that time instant wilderness. He said these WSAs, he said, they're going to be nothing but contentious, and it's going to be very difficult from here on out. And he had already announced his retirement. He was entering the last year of his term when he died. He had already served 17 years in the Senate in his last year. So he just said, it's really going to be tough. I wish we could have gotten wilderness right off the bat. I said, we all do, Lee, but doggone it, we've had to fight so hard just to get WSA status, and we just couldn't push it any further, and he knew that. It took years and years just to get that. So it was a tough fight, largely in those days with the timber industry, much more so than today, and certainly much more so than with motorized use. We had plenty of opposition from the snowmobilers that were organized into the Montana Snowmobile Association. So there was plenty of opposition, but we didn't have, it wasn't nearly as broad in those days, and that's because there wasn't that much use in those days. And so now to see the escalation of motorized use in some of these WSAs, it's wrong, it's illegal, it's completely inappropriate, and it's highly destructive. And MWA has done some really good work in litigation, or it would be far worse than it is now.
There you get into budgets, and you get into enforcement.
That's right, and probably, realistically speaking, it's up to citizens to enforce.
Right.
We're not finding the Forest Service either with the will, the budget, or the commitment to follow through with enforcement. We're just not finding that. And so we have done some work in documenting motorized abuses, motorized trespass, and some of these areas, and have brought that to the attention of the agency and then forced the issue through litigation. Otherwise, nothing would have happened there.
You mentioned Doris Milner, you mentioned Cliff Merritt from Helena.
Yeah.
And personalities, characters, if you will, are fascinating and such a marvelous part of the history of the MWA. And I'd like to mention some names and just let you go and run with it. And I'll start with, I'm not sure, did you know Howard Zonhauser?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
No, I didn't. And that kind of preceded me.
But you knew Ed.
Yeah, I know Ed, but you're also talking about Howard Zonhauser.
Right.
Or you asked me about Howard Zonhauser,
Yes.
if I knew him.
And I
No,
wondered if that was...
no, he died tragically. He died in June of 1966, right before, only 3 or 4 months before passage of the Wilderness Act that he had authored and fought courageously for 8 years, and shepherded through the legislative process. But Zonnie, as he was affectionately known, passed away, unfortunately, in June, knowing at that time that the Wilderness Act was really a fait accompli. It was going to happen. It was all greased and ready to go, and the wheels were turning, and it was a definite reality that it was going to occur. So he knew that when he passed away, but he did not live to actually see Lyndon Johnson sign it into law on September 3rd, 1964.
He was a word master, and just to read
Oh my
that,
goodness.
Actually, in,
He
particularly
was.
in present day perspective, a very short act as far as a few pages, but it's literature to read it.
It's a work of prose. It truly is, and coming up with words like wilderness is an area that is untrammeled. That's brilliant when you think about it, and that word is often confused with trampled. you know, an area that's untrampled. Well, yeah, we don't want to trample it, but really a trammel is Old English for net.
Yeah.
So when we say untrammeled, it's unnetted by humans.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I was trying to draw at earlier when we were talking about the restraint that's implicit in the wilderness idea.
Unrestricted is what it means, but yeah, it's interesting because almost, as you say, for the punningness of it, because it makes you think of trampled.
Yeah.
I was wondering actually, what were you doing in 1964? Were you?
I was a student at the learning how to cut down trees.
So you were
learning how to
University of
destroy
Montana.
wilderness. That's what I was doing in 1964 at the University of Montana. In fact, at that time I was at forestry camp at Lubrecht, having a ball. I mean, I loved forestry school, but I look back on it now, and I certainly wouldn't select that as a major. I'd go into resource conservation and environmental studies certainly, but in those days those options didn't exist, and so I wanted to be a steward of the forest, and thought that becoming a forester was the way to do that.
But that was the attitude. I mean, I'm not that much younger than you are, and I can remember that. In fact, yeah, you know, if you want to be kind of natural, protect the forest, go out and be a forester.
Yeah, and I had in mind to go through a career path within the agency. My dad had gone through forestry school in the 30s, and at U of M, and then so I was, by golly, I was going to follow in his footsteps. He didn't pursue that as a vocation, but that's what he did in the 30s during the Depression. And so anyway, I just that was my dream, and I envisioned myself becoming a forest ranger someday.
Well, there must be a genetic component when I think of Dale Bosworth, whose father was career Forest Service, maybe in California, and then of course Stuart Brandborg and his father.
That's right.
I think there's a gene in there somewhere.
There's some kind of errant gene that's bumping around, isn't there?
I didn't mean to interrupt your listening.
No, that's all right.
Way,
another person is Stuart Brandborg.
Oh gosh, you know, I met Stuart Brandborg for the very first time in 1968. And I was in basic training. I had completed my master's on the Magruder Corridor controversy. At that time, Stuart was the head of the Wilderness Society in Washington, D.C. And I was stationed at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, undergoing my officer basic training as an engineer, as a combat engineer, getting ready to ship to Nam. And so here I am in D.C., or right next to D.C. at Fort Belvoir, and I went in to meet Stuart because I knew his dad so well. I knew old Guy Brandborg really well, and had not met Stuart. And Stuart had read my thesis, and he said, "Bill," he says, "will you write an article about the Magruder controversy for our magazine, The Living Wilderness?" That's what they called the magazine in those days, The Living Wilderness. And I said, "Well, you know, I might consider it, Brandy, but you know, if I go into academia or something, I don't want to bias my objectivity as a, you know." And he, oh boy, did I ever get a talking to over that one. He says, "You better decide right now what you stand for. You know, if you're going to play that game, why did you even investigate the Magruder Corridor controversy?" Yeah, Brandy gave me a pretty good talking to, and I went back to the base, thought about it, and the next day I got a hold of him and I said, "Brandy, you're absolutely right. It'll be an honor to write the story for The Living Wilderness. I'm on board with you." And so I did that. It was published many years ago.
Yeah, during his tenure, he really, my understanding is, directed the Wilderness Society to get more into a grassroots, regional, statewide efforts on the ground, so to speak, on a local level, and getting young people involved, which we are working on now.
Yep, it's like we've come back to realize the wisdom of that. But that was very much Brandy's emphasis. He was head of the Wilderness Society for 11 years, and then there was some kind of a big falling out with the council and some members of the council, and so he left. But yeah, he was great.
Cliff Merritt.
Well, Cliff was my mentor. When he hired me to be the Montana rep for the Wilderness Society, of course I was deeply honored, and I have always been in awe of his untiring commitment. I mean, just unwavering, and his infinite patience and doggedness. Some people burn out. Burning out would never even occur to Cliff. He just has his steady pace, just grinding along as steady as the Rock of Gibraltar. And he had so much knowledge of so many different wilderness areas and wilderness campaigns across the entire western United States that it was just awe-inspiring. And his first love, of course, was Montana. And he always, when he hired me, he said, Bill, he said, you've got two priorities. One is we've got to get the Upper Missouri Wild and Scenic River bill passed. And that had been hung up by Melcher. He said the other one is the Montana Wilderness Study Act. He said those two things. And I'm happy to say that thanks to a lot of grassroots support and people like Lee Metcalf, I'm happy to say that those two were accomplished, and fairly readily. The Upper Missouri Breaks Bill, and at that time, there had been serious dam proposals that would have inundated the White Cliffs, and so that was the main effect of Metcalf's Wild and Scenic River Bill, which he told me one time, of all the different legislative accomplishments he had during his 26 years in Congress, that was the one he felt most proud of, was his Missouri River Wild and Scenic River Bill of '76. But he felt awfully good about the Montana Wilderness Study Act.